Thank you everyone for being here and joining us today for a presentation on the Economic Outlook for 2023. I am Susan Mowbray, a partner with the Economics Consulting Group at MNP, and I actually lead our national economics practice. I'm very excited to have David Williams, the Senior Economist with the BC Business Council, and Deborah Hornbostel, the Senior Vice President of MNP's Corporate Insolvency Group, here with me today. But before we jump into their presentations, there are a few housekeeping items that we need to cover. The first is that we've set aside the last segment of our time today for our Q&A session. To submit your questions, please click on the Q&A button near the bottom of your screen. If it's not showing up, you can click the three dots next to the button to expand it. We'll try to address as many of your questions as possible, but in the event that we run out of time or you wanted to follow up, please reach out and we'll be able to answer your question. Lastly, this webinar will be recorded and a copy will be provided to everyone within a few days of the event. Okay, and then finally, there is one little thing that we do need to mention, is just to remind everybody that the material David and Deborah are presenting is general in nature and it's meant to be educational. It may not be specific to your circumstances and it should not be a substitute for personalized advice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to David Williams. Over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Susan, and thanks for the invitation to speak today. It's good to be speaking with you all virtually, and I hope this presentation is somewhat helpful to you as you navigate what's sure to be an interesting year in 2023. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do is outline the outlook for the global economy and for Canada, and then finish by looking at some of the challenges that we're facing as we go into 2023. Next slide. So just to put the pandemic in a bit of context, pandemics aren't new. We've had 7 of them just since 1900. But COVID-19 was by far the worst. It's the worst since, the worst since the Spanish flu that started in 1918, and then the Black Death, which was 75 million people in 1347. So we've been going for about 4 years now, and we've had about 7 million fatalities. So it is, they do happen. And 7 million, I suppose, is a lower bound estimate because the data from China on the fatalities there are somewhat unreliable. So maybe more than 7 million, but nonetheless, it has been a very significant event facing the global economy. Next slide, please. So in terms of the outlook, next, please. Next slide. How did we get here? Well, as the vaccines were developed and rolled out, and that was obviously tremendously successful in Canada, we saw a rapid, unbalanced economic recovery, very focused on mortgage credit. Mortgage credit expanded by about 35% within only a couple of years. So we ended up in a situation where we've got excess demand for goods, services, and labor. There are a few parts to that. One is that global supply chains have been disrupted by the pandemic. And of course, when you've got very strong demand for goods, that's going to put a lot of pressure on those same supply chains. And then Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 22 caused a lot of disruption to financial markets and to energy markets. And that has also had an inflationary effect. It's really compounded the problem that was already there. And part of that is because we had very extreme levels of fiscal and monetary policy stimulus for demand that you could argue was appropriate in 2020, but it certainly became less appropriate as we moved through 2021 and even into mid-2022. And that was really the first time that central banks, at least, started to ease back on the accelerator and start to move interest rates back towards a more neutral and less stimulatory level. So we had too much stimulus for too long. And that wasn't just true in Canada, that was true in the US and most other advanced countries. And then finally, inflation reached the inflation targets of the central banks by about March of 2021. And then by April, it was already at 3% and climbing. But policymakers, both fiscal and monetary policymakers, kept that level of extraordinary stimulus in place because they deemed this inflation uptick was transitory, and that's proved to be a remarkable misjudgment. I think this period will be known as the Great Reinflation, similar to what we saw in the 60s and 70s. Looking ahead to 2023, we have the weakest global GDP growth outlook in 40 years. You have to go back to the 1980s to see a weaker global backdrop if you exclude the global financial crisis and the COVID recessions from that set. So where we might end up is we might end up with a global recession. It's not certain, but it's certainly a strong possibility. But it will be a very different recession to the ones that we're used to. The 2000 recession, the 2008 recession, and the 2020 recession. In all those periods, inflation was a lot lower, and so central banks had much more room to move to try and come to the rescue, sort of like a Hollywood hero, swashbuckling rescue from the central banks to support the economy. That's not going to be possible this time. This is more like a recession that we've seen in the early 1980s and the early 1990s, where the central banks having to play the role of the villain and taking away the punch bowl from the party and just trying to cool demand to help demand get back into balance with supply. Again, not just true in Canada. This is a global comment. At the same time, we've got inflation upwards of 6% in most advanced economies. In Canada, it's peaked at around 8%. In the UK, it's even higher, around 10%. And this is, like an extra tax on households and businesses, and it's providing huge windfalls to government revenues through really no effort on their part. Their budget balances have been improving dramatically. The thing is that part of that has been spent. About 45% of that windfall in Canada has been spent back into the economy, really quite out of sync with what central banks are trying to do in terms of cooling demand. And so it just makes that job just that bit harder for central banks. They're going to have to keep interest rates higher for longer to try and cool demand and get into balance with supply. And so for Canada, the good news is, I guess, and a very qualified good news, that we may dodge a recession in GDP, but we're already in recession in GDP per capita, and it's likely to fall further in 2023. And GDP per capita is, that's real income. That's what you get to take to the shops to buy your groceries. Having a larger GDP just means you've got a larger economy in total. It doesn't mean people are better off. And so what's underpinning this is we really have an absence of structural reforms in Canada to try and improve the productivity of our workforce and then improve average real incomes. The Business Council of British Columbia, we're a public policy agency. We interact with government on behalf of British Columbia's largest and leading companies. So this is something that we are really pushing very hard with government. And I should say at this point, if you are interested in becoming a member of the Business Council, we'd certainly be interested in talking with you. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to give some more good news, which is if you're a country, you really want to be, also there's a poll that's just come up. Do you expect the Canadian economy to go into recession in 2023? Yes or no? So you can answer that question and perhaps answer it now, and then maybe by the end you'll have a different answer. Who knows? So we'll talk about that. Okay, so onto the good news. This is the ratio of Canada's export prices to import prices. It's known as Canada's external terms of trade. If you're a country, you always want to be selling things that people want and getting great prices for it, and then importing things that you don't make or make less of from other countries and pay low prices for it. So in Canada, we tend to export commodities and manufacturing, and we're getting excellent prices for those things. The world wants to buy those products from us. And we tend to import consumer products, iPhones and other assorted goods and services, and we pay fairly low prices for that. So that's really lifting Canadians' purchasing power. The dollar is going quite a bit further in terms of buying things. Next slide, please. The next piece of good news is that if you'd asked me what the global outlook was 3 months ago, it was quite a bit darker. So it has improved slightly, and top of the list driving that is that the China's government were pursuing a zero COVID policy, lots of lockdowns, very disruptive to the economy. They've relented on that following widespread protests and disruption. So they have reopened their economy as of November and December of 2022. That's good news for the global economy because it means more productive capacity coming online. And that's going to relieve those pressures on goods inflation in particular. And to a lesser degree, outbound tourists, as Chinese tourists start traveling again internationally, that may be provide some support to the tourist sections of our economy. The supply chain bottlenecks that we saw through the latter part of 2020, early 2021, that continued for sort of 2.5 years, they've largely been resolved, and shipping costs are back to their pre-pandemic levels. We're also seeing stronger than expected momentum in advanced economies at the moment, but it may be fleeting because central banks have to raise rates further to try and, again, cool demand and bring it into balance with supply. And if core inflation doesn't start to fall, we may see some additional increases to interest rates to make sure that happens. So where things land is that we've got goods prices and headline inflation starting to ease in some advanced countries, but services inflation and core inflation are still quite high. Next slide, please. So I mentioned earlier the global backdrop is quite weak. Here is world, Canada, United States, Euro area, looking at the GDP forecasts for this year and next year compared to 2021 and 2022. 2021 was obviously a very strong year, lots of spare capacity coming back online, which continued into 2022, which is a bit of a shame because, of course, that contributed to inflation. 2023 now, we sort of get the hangover from that. Global growth comes down to 1.9%. That's very, very weak. The average for 2000 to 2019 is 3.8% for global growth. So very, very weak outlook. Canada, about 1%. We could expect some quarters of growth of about 0. So we really are right on the cusp of recession. The same for the US, eking out just 0.5% through the year, in the Euro area, 0.2%. As I mentioned earlier, the bright spot is China, coming back online and with growth of about 5.4%. So that's the good news. Next slide, please. So the elephant in the room is runaway global inflation. Central banks really lost control of inflation over the last couple of years. It was worse in certain countries like Canada and the US 6 months ago. Canada, we peaked at 8.1%. We're down to 6.3%, but core inflation is still very high. It's 5 to 6% and shows no sign of easing just yet. The United Kingdom, the Euro area, and Australia are all seeing higher rates of inflation that they had 6 months ago. So this is really, these are multiples of the central bank targets. So there's still quite some way to go to get back to 2 or 3%, depending on the target. Next slide, please. So for Canada, we've really got an overheated economy, just too much demand for goods, services, and labour relative to the available supply. It's not often that the CPI rate is above the unemployment rate. It's really only happened in the 70s and early 80s. We're down to about 5% with the unemployment rate at the moment. As I mentioned, 6.3 for the CPI rate, which is thrice the Bank of Canada's target. So clearly an overheated economy. Next slide, please. And what's behind that? Well, part of it is certainly the amount of stimulus that has been provided to the economy over a number of years. So this is federal government spending in billions, and there's 3 major components to that: transfers to persons, program expenses, and transfers to other levels of government, mostly provinces. And each of those components has been detrended. Sorry, there's a trend line there that you can see going back to 1979. Even before the pandemic, the level of federal government spending was certainly above the long-term trend. It wasn't excessively so, but it certainly was leaning above the long-term trend. And then in 2020, 2021, we saw just huge levels of spending, World War II levels of spending without very much scrutiny. I have to say, we were one of the only countries of the world that didn't produce a federal budget in 2020. All other countries produced a budget and tabled it to their parliament, and there was some scrutiny over it. Canada didn't produce a budget document, and the spending was really just rubber stamped through the parliament, which was largely shut down through 2020. So very high levels of spending, and it's really only now getting back to providing some scrutiny to federal government spending. 2021, 22, the year after the pandemic, there was a budget that year, but it was a 750-page document. Very hard to find the information that you're looking for in that sea of text. So not a great budget document. It's been pretty heavily criticized. So plenty of stimulus is the bottom line to this program. Spending is 75 billion above trend. Transfers to individuals is 35 billion above trend, and even transfers to other governments is about 15 billion above trend. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, and then the Bank of Canada, they had a new inflation mandate given to them by the government. Inflation in that mandate went from being, I guess you'd say, the lead actor to more of part of an ensemble cast. There was all sorts of other concerns the bank was supposed to take into consideration, like maximum sustainable employment, income inequality, technological change, climate change, quite, as I say, an ensemble cast of considerations for the bank. And then we had the narrative that inflation was going to be transitory. And so a very delayed reaction to that. You can see interest rates remaining on the floor until very, very late into 2022. Didn't really get back to neutral until the second half of 2022. So where we stand today is interest rates, the policy rate is at 4.5%. The all item CPI has peaked. It's come down to about 6.3, but core inflation is still very high. If you strip out those volatile items like energy and food, we're still running in the fives. So essentially 30% of the CPI is goods sector inflation. That's cooling. But 70% of the CPI is services related, and that's more domestically orientated, and that's still quite elevated. Next slide, please. Okay, there's been quite a bit of commentary that Canada had a strong recovery coming out of COVID. It's sort of true and it sort of isn't. So I just want to dig into that a little bit. This chart here looks at GDP growth from the supply side. So the amount of output you can generate in an economy is a function of how much labor input you put into it. So that you measure that as total hours worked across the whole economy. And then how productive the workforce is, how much value added is created per hour that is worked. That's called labor productivity. Where the reason why GDP recovered in Canada is simply because we added more people to the workforce. Unemployment came down to 5%, and then we had very rapid population growth. So what's really propelling Canada's GDP is just more labor inputs. There's just more people. It's not coming from the productivity side. We're not becoming more innovative. We're not scaling up. We're not exporting. It's not a great news story. And as I'm going to dig into this a little bit more, but I mean, it's labor productivity that raises real incomes, not hours worked. Hours worked just raises GDP, doesn't raise GDP per capita. So I'll get into that. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's really driving the bus in Canada? As I mentioned earlier, the federal government's really has been pursuing a policy around stimulating demand through very loose fiscal policy and having no fiscal anchor. And then the other aspect of this has been growth in labor inputs. So this is the big strategy, is to ramp up population growth. We're at 1.8% growth in the population as at July the 1st last year. It's actually been, if you look at the quarterly data since then, it's actually been even stronger than 1.8%. But I'm going to stick with this this annual figure for now. So the population increased by 703,000 people. That's a 1.8% growth. We haven't seen that rate of growth since the late 1980s, when it represented only 485,000 people. So it's a lot of extra people. The 50-year average growth in the population is more like 330,000 people per year. And even during the pandemic, we still got 220. It wasn't 220,000 people. It wasn't that much lower than the long run average. But before the pandemic, we were growing the population by about 536,000 people. Now we're at 703. And as I mentioned, I think that number is even higher, is going to be higher when we look at this for the following year. Next slide, please. So where that's really coming from is this, the federal government, when it thinks about how to expand the productive capacity of Canada, it really thinks about expanding the labour supply. So that's really coming from immigration. And of course, when you grow the population through natural increase, through births minus deaths, it tends to be more distributed across the country. When you do it by immigration, and you probably see my entry to Canada somewhere on that graph, little blip there. It tends to be focused on the gateway cities, like Vancouver, Toronto, and so forth. So very city-orientated population growth that we're seeing. So again, 1.8% growth in the population, 660,000 of that is coming from immigration. The last time population growth was this high was in the late 80s, but then immigration was only 289,000, and 200,000 was coming from births minus deaths, the natural increase. So again, just a very city concentrated economic growth strategy, really based on expanding the labour supply. Okay, next slide, please. So as I mentioned, if you increase labour inputs, you get more GDP, but you don't get more GDP per person. And that's really evident. We're one of the only advanced countries that has not yet recovered its pre-pandemic level of GDP per person. We were 56,300 before, we're at 56,200. So we're still 0.2% below our pre-pandemic level. So that's an incomplete recovery. And now we're going into a period where GDP per person is likely to fall further. And again, this reflects our lack of labour productivity focus and also serially weak performance on that score. Next slide, please. So looking at Canada in GDP, in per capita terms, I'm just going to provide some scenarios here on this chart. It's a little complicated, so I'll just go through it. The blue bars, what I've done is I've looked at the Bank of Canada's forecast for GDP growth for 2023, which was 1%. And then from that, you make some assumptions about what population growth is going to be. 1.1 would be on the low side, 1.4%. We've seen a few years like that in recent times. 1.8 again is what we saw last year. It actually could be higher than that now. I think the recent data it's showing it might be more like 2 or 2.3 next year. So if you subtract that population growth from GDP growth, you're getting sort of between -0.1 and -0.8. So this is the best case scenario for Canada. In all those scenarios, you can see we are seeing falling real income as measured by GDP per person. Now, the fall economic statement from the federal government in November provided a downside scenario where there was a recession in Canada because of a recession globally, and we only achieved growth of -0.9%. So again, if we make some assumptions about population growth and subtract that from that top line GDP growth, we end up with somewhere between -2 and -2.7%. If we achieve the level of population growth of 1.8% we had last year, then again, we're sort of -1 in the best case and -3 in the worst case. So in all realistic scenarios here, we're going to fall further in GDP per person in 2023. So this is the average income of households and businesses is going to decline, continue to decline. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's a lot of talk at the moment about labour shortages in Canada. As you'd expect with an overheated economy, it's really overcooked. The unemployment rate's only about 5%. So at the Business Council, we looked into where these vacancies are, and there are 1 million job vacancies in Canada, but they're mostly at the entry level. So if you cut the data by the level of experience required, over 80% of the jobs are in positions that require no experience or less than a year in experience or 1 to 3 years of experience. These are not, their job vacancies are not at the experience end of the scale. There's very little uptick there. Next slide, please. So looking at the same data for the third quarter of last year, which is the latest quarter, these are all the job vacancies in Canada, and what's shown there above the bars is the average offered hourly wage. So again, more than 500,000 jobs require less than a year of experience, and they pay $20.50 on average. And then there's another 300,000 jobs that require 1 to 3 years of experience, and they pay about $24.10. Very few of the job vacancies are requiring higher levels of experience than obviously paying wages. So yeah, again, the job vacancies are at the lower end of the scale, entry-level positions paying low wages. Next slide, please. Now, cutting the million job vacancies that we have by the level of by the qualification level required. Again, most of the uptick in the job vacancies is coming from jobs that don't require any education at all. And then the second strongest increase is from jobs that only require the completion of high school. There's a little bit of an uptick in jobs requiring a trade certificate or an apprenticeship or a college education, but not really very much, from the higher education, above a bachelor's degree. Just next slide, please. So this is cutting that same data and looking at the average offered wage. Again, most of the job vacancies require no education at all, and they pay $18.80 an hour. And then secondly, jobs requiring high school completion, they're paying about $20.35 on average. And then representing about 10% of jobs vacancies each are those requiring a trade certificate or a college diploma or a bachelor's degree, and they do pay slightly higher wages. Okay, next slide, please. So just to understand where those vacancies are, here are the top 20 occupations across Canada. There are 500 occupational codes that Statistics Canada tracks. That's how the data is divided. These are the top 20, representing 450,000 vacancies, or about 45% of the total. The number one, of course, is food counter attendants and kitchen helpers. There are about 73,000 there. Retail salespersons, another 50,000 there. And then next slide. Now I'm just going to color the data here to show the jobs in green are the occupations that do require a university degree. And together that's about 4% of all vacancies in Canada. And no surprises there, it's nurses and psychiatric nurses, and then also IT analysts and consultants. It's about 10,000 IT analyst jobs vacant in Canada right now. The orange occupations are those that require a trade certificate or an apprenticeship or a college education. The black occupations there, the black text, they're the jobs that require either some on-the-job training or specific training is provided. It's usually fairly short, or no training at all, but certainly not requiring a formal qualification from a Canadian institution, educational institution. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up by talking about some of the challenges facing Canada in 2023. Next slide. And no surprises that our level of indebtedness is a concern. I mean, this is an era now of higher interest rates. I suppose if you're a very heavy borrower, inflation is a benefit because, of course, you can inflate away the debt. The downside is that your debt servicing costs go up because of course, central banks have to raise interest rates. So that's a real concern as to how we're going to adjust to a higher interest rate world. Before the pandemic, Canada was the 5th most indebted country in the world. We're now the 4th. Our corporate sector is the 13th most indebted corporate sector in the world. Our household sector is the 3rd most indebted, was the 5th before the pandemic. And our government sector, which includes provinces and the federal government, is the 11th most indebted. So that means we've got total debt in the economy of about 325% of GDP, again, placing us fourth in the world. Very heavy debt load. Next slide, please. And the challenge around that is that we're not really generating much income growth for all that debt. This is the OECD's forecasts for growth in GDP per person over the next 10 years. The blue bars is your labor productivity contribution, and your orange bar is your labor utilization or hours worked per capita. And we're about the 7th last in the OECD over this period for labor productivity growth, and that's really what is dragging us down and putting us at the back of the pack. Leading up to the pandemic, I should say, we were growing at around 0.8% per annum in GDP per person. So this is not really a radical forecast to say that we're going to do 0.7. It's pretty similar. The OECD is really saying we're going to track about the same as what we've been doing, but other countries are going to accelerate because of a better productivity performance. Next slide, please. And then looking to 2030 to 2060, we tick up to 0.8, but again, that puts us last. And the blue bar there is our labor productivity performance again. So that's that's GDP per hour worked. And we are dead last in the OECD for labor productivity growth. And then hence we're dead last also for growth in GDP per person. So if you're a young person entering the workforce today, you're looking at 40 years with the lowest growth in average real incomes across the 38 OECD countries. It's a fairly grim outlook, and it really should be the #1 concern of Canadian policymakers. Next slide, please. I won't go into all the contributors to that, but one of them is the level of Canadian investment per worker. So this is, as I say, this is capital investment in machinery and equipment, software, R&D, physical buildings, and engineering structures, divided by the number of workforce. Divided by the workforce. This is analysis from the C.D. Howe Institute. The Business Council here, we've done some analysis of this by province as well, so much deeper analysis for Canada, and it's available on our website. So if you want to dig into that, you can. The key takeaway here is that the level of investment per worker is declining, whereas in most other countries across the OECD and especially in the US, the level of investment is rising. Of course, a workforce is more productive when they have the best tools, the latest technologies, and they can operate at scale. But we are moving, unfortunately, in the other direction. So where we are at the moment is that if you plot the capital stock in Canada on a per worker basis, it's actually it's a flat line, or it's actually shrinking in recent times. So I've been a professional economist for a few decades, and I didn't even think this was possible to have a capital stock that was actually shrinking. So what that means is that Canadian firms have been investing barely enough to keep up with the depreciation of the capital stock that they have. So it's a very serious concern, I think, for the business sector. Next slide. And then, there was a lot of angst around, the Trump administration and the protectionism that was being discussed at that time. But I think Canada has to look to its own backyard. This chart here shows the change in the share of exports. Exports as a share of GDP since 1980, and just indexed to 1980 levels. Most countries in the OECD and Europe have been expanding their integration with markets, increasing their exports as a share of GDP. Canada has been going the opposite direction for 20 years. So since 2000, we've seen a declining share of exports in GDP. And in fact, we're back to the level of openness to trade that we had in 1980. And if you want to know what the hit song of 1980 was, if anyone can remember that, it was actually Call Me by Blondie. So we are back to sort of Blondie levels of trade integration in Canada. Stay in your mind. So that's of a concern. Obviously, if you want to be competing with the best in the world, you need to be in international markets. Just if you're an athlete, you should be trying to compete in the World Championships or the Olympics, rather than competing in sort of your local domestic competition. And that's more what Canada has been doing, rather than competing on the world stage. So that, I think, is another very important concern that policymakers need to address. We have been very concerned with trade diversification, and I would suggest that we need to move to a just grow exports strategy. Just expand exports as a share of GDP from wherever we can get the growth. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, I think that Canada will dodge a recession in GDP in 2023, but that's really only, it's a very qualified remark because it's really only because of booming population and labour force growth, again, concentrated in the major cities. And that's because of Ottawa's focus on growing labour inputs through record levels of temporary and permanent immigration. The permanent immigration is about 500,000, but the temporary immigration is another 150 to 200,000 people on that, and often doesn't get much mention in the media. But we had 660,000 for net international migration last year. So these are very, very strong numbers. And it's just, if you're growing the population by 700,000 people a year, it's hard to envisage that the economy will shrink in absolute terms. We'd have to see a very, very large increase in unemployment to actually reduce the level of output in the economy. But that doesn't mean that we're better off in per capita terms. Canada likely won't avoid a recession in GDP per capita. Indeed, we haven't actually exited the recession coming out of COVID. We're still about 0.2% below our pre-pandemic level. And as I mentioned in that chart, we could decline by another 0.5 or 1 to 3% in 2023, depending on the scenario that plays out. The other challenge is that we have this very credit-centric growth model, very heavy borrowing based around particularly mortgage credit. That's going to be difficult to carry given the higher interest rates across the economy. We have the highest private sector debt servicing ratio in the G7. So this is interest and principal payments relative to income. And then we just don't have much income growth, as I mentioned. The focus is just not on productivity growth. It's not a policy priority. And so what we're really lacking is an economic strategy in Canada that raises labour productivity growth and then leads to higher real incomes as a result. And with that, I'm going to pass on to Deborah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, for that insightful presentation. It seems that for most companies, 2023 will probably be a year for more defensive rather than expansionary strategies until inflation subsides and rate increases cease. As you're all aware, 2022 came with a lot of external factors to disrupt businesses in Canada, and we're not certain what 2023 will be bringing us. I'd like to take a quick poll to find out what your most concerning business challenge for 2023 will be. So if you just take a second or two to answer that, be wonderful. I think the Canadian economy is still in relatively good shape with low unemployment, high savings ratios, good consumer spending, and high immigration, but it is about to hit some turbulence. Next slide, please. These are hot off the press bankruptcy statistics, and you can see that under the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Act, filings increased overall by 37.2% between 21 and 22. And they have been steadily increasing on a quarterly basis since 2021 all across the country, with the exception of PEI, which had very few insolvencies. For 2022, the biggest increases were in accommodation and food services and construction. It's still seeing quite a few so far this year. The only silver lining that I can see in this is the fact that the proposals are increasing higher than the bankruptcies, which to me indicates that business owners are relatively optimistic, and they do see some hope in restructuring their businesses rather than throwing in the towel. Just looking at the poll results, it seems that we've got a lot of different reasons for, and understandably why. Everybody's in a different boat these days, and a lot of different concerns. What I'd really like to share with you is the stats on the receivership filing. So if we can see the next slide. Just in case you're not aware, a receivership is normally when a secured creditor enforces its security rights over the assets of a company. And if you can see in 2021 and 22, we had the lowest levels of receivership filings in at least the past 30 years. Back around 2009 is when the receiverships filings started to come down, and they were close to around 900 back then, and they sort of leveled off at close to 500 per year. So we're nowhere near the sort of big recession of 2008, 2009. But I also would like to point out that at the start of 2020, we were on an incline on receivership filings, and we certainly would have exceeded that 500 level because the receivership filings were quite high for the first quarter of 2020. But when the pandemic hit, you know, by July, with the government subsidies coming in, they really took a plunge. And you know, it's from then on, we've got sort of three reasons why they've continued to go on the decline. And the first, of course, is the government subsidies. Secondly, there were a lot of alternative lenders available to solve liquidity problems. They're still there, but they're tightening their belts a little bit now. And the third reason is that most of the major banks, they became more focused on patient care and client retention than they used to be. They've been much more willing to work with their clients and give them an opportunity to resolve their problems during the last couple of years. However, given all the negative issues in the economies these days and the forecasts that are out there, the question on every insolvency practitioner's mind is whether or not this is really the calm before the storm. It's certainly looking that way to us, but we never know. So I would like to take one more poll before we get to the next slide, and that's just generally how our audience is concerned about financial difficulties for your business in 2023. Is it a little concern, not much, or a lot? So then on this slide, there's really no surprises here on what's on the bank's radar. Things haven't really changed as to what the bankers and lenders are looking for. But you really need to be aware that once any of these key concerns are raised, your account is probably being shadowed by a special loans officer placed on a watch list. This is a relatively new scenario for banks, as opposed to, you know, the last 10 years or so. Banks are starting to react faster to riskier loans in anticipation of upcoming difficult times. And the patient care process is probably going to be a shorter process in 2023 as the banks get busier with problem loans and they lose their patients. If you have any of these issues, you really need to be prepared to discuss them with your lender and develop a correction plan. So we also seem to have a mixed bag on the financial difficulties. It doesn't seem to be a great concern right now, and I hope that plays out. We can move to the next slide. I do want to warn all of the business owners that hope is not a strategy, and you should be prepared for some difficult times. First and foremost, you need to be prepared in advance for some strong headwinds that may come your way. You should really do some financial modeling projections under a variety of scenarios so that you can identify your risks and plan accordingly. Doing so in advance will avoid having to make decisions with your back up against the wall. For example, if you're going to need to borrow additional cash, are you prepared to pledge personal assets to get the cash and perhaps get it at a lower rate? Are you even able to service the additional debt costs? These are things that you really should consider in advance and not at the 11th hour. And as business owners, if you are going to end up advancing money to your company, please register your security over the company's assets for those advances to protect yourself. Better safe than sorry. From my perspective, I've seen a lot of business owners put everything they have into a company and not take back security for those advances. And at the end of the day, they sometimes have nothing to show for. Next slide, please. So cash conversions will become important for 2023. Be concerned about your customers having difficulties and scrutinize their credit worthiness carefully and consider accounts receivable insurance. If you're a little bit worried, your customers may be as well. You should diversify your client base and be careful not to become too dependent on certain key clients. Carefully monitoring your inventory levels to preserve cash, carefully considering whether just in time inventory versus just in case is better for you. Many companies switched to just in case inventory purchases during the pandemic just to make sure that they had inventory. And as David said, a lot of those shortages are sort of alleviated now. So maybe you can just check your inventory level so you don't have too much money tied up in there. You should also look around to see if there are alternatives to borrowing money that can improve liquidity, such as selling redundant assets, equipment, and inventory, or simply extending your accounts payable if possible. My advice is to keep a rainy day cupboard of capital in case of an unexpected shortfall in liquidity in the coming year. Next slide, please. So these are just a few suggestions to consider to counteract the impact of inflation. Generally, if you can, pass the increased costs onto your customers. Reduce discretionary spending wherever possible, and generally undertake steps to increase efficiencies and decrease costs. Next slide, please. So as I previously mentioned, defensive rather than expansionary strategies are best during challenging times. So capital expenditures should really only be undertaken if they will improve efficiencies on a cost-effective basis. And just don't spend too much during the challenging times. Next slide, please. So lenders, they'll be looking for your financial statements, and it is important to keep your lender happy and provide the information that they're looking for. If you do have issues of concern, be upfront with them. They hate surprises, and if they find that you're being deceitful, they quickly lose their patience. So also do your best to keep CRA payments current. Some business owners tend to use CRA as a bank during difficult times. I don't advise it. The penalty and interest is expensive, and being offside with CRA really triggers alarm bells for lenders. Not to mention that it's also director liability. Next slide, please. As business owners, you should always be protecting yourself as a director. And these are just a few things to remember. to be aware of that could potentially come back and haunt you. Next slide, please. I'm just rushing through this because I know we're a little bit short on time. Remember again that hope is not a strategy. Don't stick your head in the sand. If you've got financial problems, seek assistance from an MNP licensed insolvency trustee before the storm becomes too much to handle. And hopefully it won't be as bad as some of us are predicting, but I think it is coming. That's it for me.
Great, thank you, Deborah. That was very, very interesting. We've had a lot of questions posted in the chat, and I know, conscious of everyone's time, we'll try to answer as many of them as we can, and if we don't, we will follow up after with answers to the best of our ability. So I'm going to start with one for you, David. The question is, what is your assessment of the lag time between changes to interest rates and them fully impacting inflation and GDP growth? So for example, the interest rate increases that happened at the end of 2022 will not fully impact the economy until blank. So what would you say that, when would you expect the full impact of those to hit?
Yeah, thanks, Susan. Generally, the lags of monetary policy on the real economy, GDP, is about 12 to 18 months. So, we started seeing interest rates being taken off zero, March of 2022. So I would say, in the second quarter of this year, we'll start to see some effects. Moving into the second half of this year, we'll see some more, but we won't really see the full effects of higher interest rates until 2024.
And I guess, what does that mean in terms of what we can maybe expect about interest rates in the next year or two? So do we expect, if it takes that long to happen?
Yeah, the Bank of Canada has said that they're going to take a bit of a pause at the moment to sort of see what the effects are on the economy. They moved very late, as I mentioned, but they did move. When they did move quicker than other central banks. The Bank of England, the Federal Reserve are still moving. They haven't moved off their contractionary bias. So still further interest rate hikes expected. So our policy rate in Canada may stay at 4.5% for a little while. That doesn't mean that interest rates on financial markets are necessarily going to stay there. They may move a little higher because of further action by other central banks around the world, which will still tighten financial conditions.
Okay, thank you. And I guess there's been a few questions about sort of the data that you presented, David, in terms of productivity growth and in terms of exports. And so one of those things, one of the questions, and this is something that we've come across when we've done some of our research, is do you believe the productivity gap coming out of COVID is due to companies having to hire 1.5 to 2 employees for a single role, given employees are taking more sick leave for themselves or to provide care to sick family members?
Yeah, anecdotally, we've heard that. I think it's plausible, but what you've got to remember is that since about 2000, so nearly 20 years up until the pandemic, productivity growth in Canada was tracking at about 0.9% per year. So it's been pretty stable. And then if you measure real wages, and the proper way to do that is total compensation, including non-money benefits, all the employer contributions to life insurance and dental and CPP and EI that they make on behalf of employees, must include that because that's been a larger share of compensation. And then if you deflate that into real terms using output prices, which is the same metric you're using for labor productivity, that's known as real product wages. So if you compare real product wages and labor productivity growth in Canada, they're both doing about 0.9% per year. And I don't really see much that's changing that trend. We're not seeing a big lift coming out of COVID because we're all moving to online and using more digital technologies. We're not seeing that in the productivity data. So I'm a bit skeptical of that. Some people have said, maybe the labor productivity data is missing all of these technologies and all the benefits that are being created from that. I'm again a bit skeptical of that claim, because if we were creating all of this incredible value added in the economy that was just being missed by Statistics Canada, then we would see it show up in real product wages. We would see it show up in compensation, and we don't. Compensation is tracking about the same pace in real terms when you measure it correctly as labour productivity, which is exactly what economic theory predicts. So I just don't see this big uptick in labour productivity, and I think Canada's got a very big challenge on its hands to turn that around. And one of the reasons for that is the retreat from international trade, as I mentioned, and another is the focus on labour inputs rather than capital inputs and technology inputs to business. As I mentioned, the capital stock, which includes software, R&D, mining and exploration intelligence, physical structures, machinery and equipment, is actually declining relative to the number of workers. So that's not a recipe for productivity growth. That's a recipe for very weak productivity growth, if at all. So that's one of the challenges that we have to overcome. And as I mentioned earlier, I think when Ottawa thinks about how to expand Canada's productive capacity, all of the conversation seems to be on how do we increase the number of labour inputs. And as I mentioned, that raises GDP, but it doesn't raise GDP per person. And the academic literature is very clear on that. I just want to add a footnote. I saw one of the questions that's coming up, so I'm just going to answer it now. On GDP per person, that's our key measure of living standards in the economy. And someone asked, what about income inequality? Well, we tend to import American narratives. Being so close to Canada, we tend to get a lot of US news up here. And so we've got to be really careful around importing US narratives around what's happening to inequality to Canada, because then they don't actually hold. If you look at the Gini coefficients, which is how we measure the income distribution, income inequality has been going down for about 20 years, whether you measure it through market incomes or after-tax incomes. Both measures they both increased in the 80s and 90s, but they've both been declining since the early 2000s. If you look at the lower end of the distribution, the income distribution around poverty rates, measured poverty rates are going down since 2005. They've been tracking down. The Canada Child Benefit's been really helpful and accelerated that decline. And if you look at the share of income going to the top of the income distribution, that also peaked in the early 2000s. So it doesn't really matter which metric of income you use. Income inequality in Canada peaked 20 years ago, and it's been declining ever since. The big increase in inequality was in the 80s and 90s in Canada, not in the last 20 years. So I don't think the stagnation in GDP per capita growth or productivity growth over the last 20 years has actually improved our situation at all.
I think we're out of time. I want to say once again, we just do have a quick poll before we thank everyone for their time, and we'll do our best to follow up with the email. I know we didn't get a chance to answer all the questions, and there's still some really great questions remaining. We'll do our best to follow up with the questions, but thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.